Okay, so now that we've finished putting the rest of the water inside here, we want to make sure that this tray is down here to be able to catch the water and the chips that come off of the metal. From this point, there are two things that we have to be considerate of when we're getting ready to cut our piece of material. This is like a stop. So the stop is an Allen wrench right here to tighten and loosen it, and it'll move in and out for the stop. I'm not going to worry about the stop today because all we're going to do is just make a couple small cuts. The second thing that you got to worry about is you got to make sure that your guides are not too far apart. Right here it is measured both in inches and metric system. So when we put it down and we see what type of material we're going to cut, then you have to adjust these arms so that they're not far apart. We're going to get it as close as we can to the metal. When this comes down and it comes inside this little track, it will automatically stop cutting. So it'll go through, cut the piece, and once it gets into the track, it'll stop. So we're going to go ahead and get a piece of metal, and we're going to put that inside there and tighten it up. If you notice, the vise, you can lift it up and move it by hand to get to a point where it's going to catch. Once it catches, then what you're going to do is you're going to adjust the vise in until it tightens. You want to make sure your piece is level, and my parts that hold this out, if it's a longer piece, are in the shop. I didn't get it, so all we're going to do is just make a small cut. It shouldn't be any big deal, because what we're going to do is we're going to cut off the metal to get a true end first before we measure. All right, what I just did is I turned on the tensioner and I moved it so I could bring your arm down to a position where one or two things are going to happen. We're going to measure it to make sure, after we get a true cut, we're going to measure it to make sure that's what we're going to get when we make the cut. The second thing, we're going to loosen this up. All right, so this should be loose enough to where it clears, the guides clear the vise. So once you get it to where you want it to be, you tighten it up, make sure the guard is tight, and make sure our blades are covered. Now, the tension's off, so it's not going to go anywhere. We're going to turn the machine on and kind of run the fluid through so it doesn't cut dry too much. So we're going to come over here, turn off your e-stop. Now, when you look at the blade teeth are pointing towards the motor. So that means this thing is turning this way. You got to make sure the blade is turning in the right direction for cutting. So we're going to turn this back on. Now, once the fluid or the coolant comes down, or the cutting fluid comes down, then we should be ready to start cutting. If you notice, it's coming here to the guides and to the blade itself. So since we're making a true cut, all we want to do is cut this piece of metal where it's at. So we're going to turn our tensioner on, and we want to put the tension We'll say this one's going to be about 2.5 to 3 on the setting. And what that's going to do, it's going to come down slow enough to be able to cut the material at a good speed. Now this material that I'm cutting is a pipe, so it really isn't that hard, but sometimes you'll have a solid piece of metal that you got to adjust the tension and let the saw do its work. Remember I mentioned that during the time we were doing the vertical band saw. Now the tension you can adjust depending on what you're cutting. If we want to take this to 3, it'll cut a little faster. You don't want to get it too fast or else the blade will stop. It'll completely stop. Once that goes to the bottom of the cut, it's going to go finish through that cut, and once it gets into that track, like I said, it'll automatically stop. Now, one of the things you have to be careful for, anytime that you have anything rubbing or any kind of friction, it could be hot. So be careful if you pick it up. This one's not too hot because we had a lot of friction, a lot of coolant on it. So this is probably one of the straightest cuts that I've seen in any of the machines that come out of here. So we're going to set this off to the side. That's our true cut. So now we're going to turn off the tensioner, put it back to 0. We're going to lift up this arm. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and measure a piece to cut. So this blade, it measures from the inside of the blade on the inside of the cut, because what's happening is the kerf is the thickness of the blade, and that's what you're going to cut off. Now, if I give you a tolerance of 1/16 of an inch, and you don't take the kerf into consideration, you just blew your tolerance. So what we're going to do is we're going to move this to cut 2 inches off of this piece of material. Okay? So again, we come over to the vise. Make sure you hold on to your metal because it's going to loosen up. So we'll loosen the vise up. Bring it out. We'll say 2 inches, and then we'll check it. Tighten this up. To check it, we're going to take this measuring instrument, bring down the arm just a little bit. Make sure you turn off the tension when you're doing that. And we're going to measure out from that point. That is measuring about 1 3/4 inches, so we need to adjust it out. I want to take more than one measurement, because if you don't, you're going to blow your tolerance, and then you're not going to have the piece that you need, and you're going to give yourself more work. Okay, since I didn't give a tolerance, this is about 1/8 off. We'll cut it there, so it should be 1 7/8 when I take it out and measure it. So what we want to do with the tension off, we want to lift the arm just a little bit. We want to make sure that the vise is tight. Since we're cutting the same piece of material, we'll leave everything the way it's set up. So, turn it on. Our tension was set about 3 before. We can keep it at 3. Now it's taking its time to come down because we have it at a certain tension. So once it starts, we'll go ahead, keep it there. If we can keep it a little bit more, we'll adjust the tension and keep it the way it is. It depends on how it's cutting. You want to make sure that you wait until the machine stops. Never put your hand in there while the blade is running. Okay, this is a measured part that we want. Again, there's sharp edges on here. You got to make sure that it's deburred and make sure everything is good the way it should be. So if we have it measured the way that it was before we started cutting, we should have 1 7/8 of an inch. So this cut to the size that you measure, right? Do not waste my material and not measure at least 2 or 3 times. You got to make sure that you're measuring all the time. One last thing before we go ahead and close up. You want to make sure the tension's off. Want to lift the blade up. I have to show you something. If you take a look at the length of the vise, if you have a smaller piece that is not the full length of the vise, let's say it's half the length, you have to get a adapter to fit in the vise so that the vise doesn't go at an angle and it doesn't hold your proper material. And what that means is you're going to put your piece here, and then you're going to put another piece the same size, another pipe, on this end so the vise closes completely. Now, right now, we're not going to worry about cleaning up, but I am going to take the material out of the vise and set it down. So what we're going to do is loosen this up, make sure you got a hold of the material. Pull the vise out. Set the material like that. One of the things that you have to also consider when we're cutting is the type of material. If you're cutting a round piece, which is over here on the side, if you don't put it in the vise correctly, it's going to spin on you. So you got to take a look right here and make sure that it fits inside there. Sometimes we have to put blocks on the side that will hold that in, like it's fit to the size that it's supposed to be. One of the things that we want to mention before we close out, all the things that we talked about before, which is the orientation, the safety, the pre-inspection, the material and the cleanup has been taken care of. But I also mentioned that you need to consider certain things. The important part of this while we're doing the operation is your blade kerf, the tolerance, and to measure. They always tell you, or I've always heard, measure twice, cut once. That concludes the class, and make sure you take notes because there will be a test.